An ominous quote. A sensational graphic. A leading question. And a 15-minute speed run of half-truths. That's the documentary I was preparing to share with you all, and it's likely the documentary you've already seen before. So I stopped myself, and I had a crisis. Let's be candid here, YouTube content is pop history. We pre-digest academic information and regurgitate it to you on a snazzy platter. And the format itself is, honestly, quite restricting in terms of scope and depth, since much of what we do is more artistry than education, but hopefully it's a blend of the two. We have to oversimplify a ton, and there's often misconceptions which, intentionally or not, still get perpetuated by our videos. This is usually fine for most topics, and it's the song and dance that we kind of have to accept. The idea being that there's the public, there's academia, and then there's us YouTubers in the middle serving as ambassadors to hopefully get you all closer to the scholarly front lines. And this was a situation I found myself, trying to bring you all to the front lines of the Bronze Age collapse. But what I had an issue with was the more I dug, the more I looked into things, the thicker the cloud of fog was in terms of trying to determine where even are the academic front lines on the Bronze Age collapse. There's so many questions, there's so many uncertainties, and I hit a crisis. I was just trying to answer the question succinctly, why did the Bronze Age collapse? Now in the past, pop history has had a simple answer. It was the Sea Peoples. Now, quite quickly after that, people were like, well, actually no. And that's kind of where I was heading in the direction of this documentary. Academics will come to you and say, well, no, it's not just the Sea Peoples, it was probably a combination of factors. The systems failure approach, where it's drought, famine, plague, earthquakes, political unrest, economic decline, military innovation, the list goes on and on. Now on the face of it, this second option, presenting multiple factors as opposed to one, seems much more plausible, and so I decided to start producing my documentary with this in mind. But this is where I ran into some problems, and they're threefold. The first problem was there were too many proposed solutions. It seemed like a total gish gallop. I was being thrown a bunch of things and couldn't really put them into a coherent narrative, and it was very hard for me to buy that at this singular point in time, about a bazillion things went wrong all at once. So it seemed like someone was trying to cover their ass in terms of answers to say, well, it wasn't the Sea People, but here you go, here's a bunch of answers, and that should cover you for the Bronze Age collapse. That to me seemed almost as improbable as a singular event causing it, was all the events happening at once. Now my second issue was that when I was trying to present these disparate factors, we had to go wide, and I couldn't really give you an answer as to, well, what does it mean to have a drought? What does it mean to have an earthquake or political unrest or all these different factors? What do they mean? We had to cut all that short, and so the video very much felt like it was losing its nuance. And I needed to get those answers first, which gets me to my third point, which is, as I started to pull these threads to try and inquire about each of these factors, it revealed a world of contradictions and uncertainties in academia itself. And this is where I had, hands down, my documentary midlife crisis. I had to drop our typical YouTube format and really rethink things. So in this video, what we're going to be doing is pulling back the curtain on the whole process and go on this journey of discovery together. My hope is that this video not only provides you more education on the subject, but also more education on the process of critical thinking itself. But all of this wouldn't have been possible without today's sponsor, Total War Pharaoh. Now, a couple things are in order here. I really have to thank Creative Assembly, not just for sponsoring broadly educational marketing content, but also specifically for this video for giving me a lot of leeway in terms of what I wanted to cover, how I wanted to cover it, and in particular, when I covered it. This video was by me promised to them just about a month ago, and they've all throughout the process been very understanding of my midlife crisis of a documentarian here, and totally said, take your time, put it out when it's ready. And it's this kind of approach that I really appreciate from someone who's really interested in, the educational side of it. Now, more broadly, when it comes to me pitching Total War Pharaoh to you, is I've loved Total War for a long time now. The series has been my entry into the historical genre, and quite frankly, I've enjoyed Pharaoh as one of those entries. I know that there's a general discussion right now going about the direction of Total War, pricing, topics that they cover, etc. all that aside, I've really enjoyed Pharaoh, and it continues the tradition of me being able to play within sandboxes of history that I'm very interested in. Especially here, I was playing a lot of campaigns within the context of the collapsing Bronze Age, while in the background I had podcasts, documentaries, and lectures going on from guests like Dr. Eric Klein and others that were part of my educational process for making this documentary. So I'm going a little meta here, but that's really how I appreciate Total War Pharaoh. So I can highly recommend it from that front. Now, more specifically in terms of what the game brings, well, like I said, it sets you in the Bronze Age collapse as disaster looms on the horizon. At launch, you take command of 8 playable factions from across the Egyptian, Canaanite, and Hittite cultures. And while this is a welcome return to the historical setting, it's clear the team has carried on some of the best ideas from the recent Warhammer series. For instance, each faction is packed with unique mechanics to help set them apart. Additional mechanics such as legacies lets you further control how you play the campaign. Entire campaigns can also fully be customized each time you start, and the world itself is constantly evolving thanks to the new Pillars of Civilization mechanic, which helps represent the larger narrative of a world teetering on the edge of collapse. There's also a ton of other features worth noting, such as dynamic weather effects, which actually impact battles, new unit mechanics such as the fighting retreat option, and of course a welcome return to open-style sieges. You can get all this and more in Total War Pharaoh, so click the link below to get the game now and enjoy. With all of this context in mind, let's now start on our journey to understand the Bronze Age collapse. Here's a high-level view of the Bronze Age collapse as I've put it together for our journey. We'll be tracing it through different chapters that follow the sequence as follows. So we're going to start with a look broadly at the characteristics of the late Bronze Age. We'll look at the claims of destruction. The first posited claims of destruction being the Sea Peoples, so we'll look at them, and then more so the trend towards now thinking that climate change may be a behind-the-scenes culprit, so we'll discuss what that looks like, and then we'll look at the particulars of the collapse, be it the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians, and more. And then finally, we'll pull it all together with what it looks like to kind of piece together all this data into an overall systems collapse. So for those of you following along, we're going to be zooming in on these, looking at graphs, tables, charts, maps, excerpts from articles. So there is a visual component to this. So if you do have a screen, recommend that you look at it. But otherwise, I think the narration alone will still give you most of the information. So just wanted to put that at the front end before we dive in. And without further ado, let's do so. So let's start off with our Bronze Age world. We're now talking about the late Bronze Age, so roughly 1400 to 1200 BC. This comes after a very long multi-millennia period of the stretching expanse of the Bronze Age, which you can see above is characteristic of different regions. But right now we're looking at the late Bronze Age, and there's going to be major powers that start to emerge here. There's the Mycenaean palaces in their area of influence around the Aegean, the Hittites occupying much of Anatolia, the Egyptians of the New Kingdom spanning from the borders of Nubia down to the Delta, and then variously holding extensive power up into the lands of Canaan and the Levant. And there are a bunch of other city-states in this region that might be worth mentioning, but inside the scope of this video are going to be kind of lesser focus. So this is roughly the world we're looking at. A key thing to note is that these are very powerful entities that have been around for several centuries and have formed a vast linkage of connections in terms of trade, etc. You can see that here as goods are shifted around, not just, general trade goods that are nice to have, but also important commodities, shipments of grain to make sure that people don't starve, to deal with surpluses. You have exotic goods, all kinds of stuff shifting around that makes it so that many of these systems are interconnected, and this may prove to be a chink in the armor to this era, as we'll see shortly. But one of the most important things that's being traded across this era is, of course, the ingredients it takes to make bronze. So that's going to be copper, tin, and various other metals. And so the most important one is actually going to be the sources of tin. So these are going to come in different areas. So you have the tin islands, the supposed Cassiterides over in the far west. So much of this trade extends beyond just the Mediterranean of sources, important sources of production coming from way out to the west, long exposed trade routes. Same thing goes to the east. You get a lot of metals coming in from Afghanistan, other places around Mesopotamia or the highlands that have to be trucked overland and then eventually pass hands through a bunch of people before they eventually all filter into the swirling trade routes of these empires in the Near East. And so that is kind of the world we emerge into, a very connected one. And just to show you kind of what this looks like, We have a lot of lines and claims about traded products. And just so you get a sense of this, this is one of the shipwrecks that we found off the coast of Anatolia, I believe, and it's carrying 20 tons of goods in its cargo hold. Of that, you have 1 ton of tin, 10 tons of copper, you have a bunch of ingots, lots of glass, and then a bunch of actually just what's called mastic, which is actually used as a preservative, they believe, for wine. So basically, this just goes to show the sophistication, the degree of interconnection of this world prior to the collapse. So that's setting the table for our next discussion, which is going to be the destruction of the system we just looked at. So those of you who have been exposed to this topic before will be probably familiar with both this type of map that I'm showing and this type of quote. But this is the first piece of data that I started to tease out that had a lot of red flags in it. So let's take a look. So the first thing, let's start with the quote. The quote here is going to be drawn from a rather early, I believe from the 90s book by Robert Drews, and much of what he presents is actually echoed in future works, and so we have to go to kind of the seed of where this began. And you'll see shortly why it's important to bring this up. So for instance, in his book here, The End of the Bronze Age, on roughly page 4, he says the following, quote, "Within a period of 40 to 50 years, at the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th century, almost every significant city in the eastern Mediterranean world was destroyed, many of them never to be occupied again." And he accompanies that with a map. The bottom right map is actually his original, but a derivative map can be seen in the center. And if you ever look up Bronze Age collapse, this is often what you're seeing. This view of a bunch of flames or X's or destruction across the Near East that basically shows that, hey, these were all destroyed in the Bronze Age collapse, and usually they're pinned to the same date. And as you can see in the passage we quoted above, it's essentially saying, hey, look at all these sites. They were all destroyed in the span of 40 to 50 years, roughly a generation. This is the first thing where our perception of what happened at the end of the Bronze Age really starts to fall apart. And we'll get into why. And roughly, as a teaser, the idea is, well, not all these sites were destroyed, and even if they were, they weren't destroyed in the time being claimed. So already this is misleading. So this should have a red flag anytime you run into the Bronze Age period and you're confronted with something sensational like this about destruction, all in a singular time frame. Be very, very suspicious. And we'll go into why. This is mostly going to be epitomized by a nice recent article by Jesse Malik, and it's entitled "The Fall of the Bronze Age and the Destruction That Wasn't." And essentially what he does is he looks at these early claims from the 90s and onwards from various actually scholarly articles that seem to parrot these same types of exaggerations. And what Jesse did in his paper here and looking into things is he actually starts to find that when you scratch the surface of these claims, they really don't hold true. And what he exposes is essentially false destruction that's captured and that's exaggerated. And he says that this probably comes from a couple different sources. One is the incorrect dating of findings. The second is once people investigate those findings, they make assumptions of said destruction with limited or even no data in some cases. And then finally, he also finds cases of false citation, where perhaps the original archaeological records said that something was perhaps burned, and then later someone turns that into it being destruction, and you kind of have it propagate and become something more than it originally was. So from those three major sources of findings, he says that, oh, the data is not really true when it comes to the severity of the destruction. Then he tries to put some numbers behind it, and that's what I've done here, highlighting his article. And basically, he looked at a sampling of archaeological literature, and he found that 61% of these have either been misdated, assumed based on little evidence, or simply have never happened. And by that percent, I mean how many sites are claimed to be destroyed. So in the written literature, 61% have false destruction. He then looks, for instance, at Drew's map here, which has 60 destructions, and by looking into them, he found that actually 52% of these were false destructions. So this starts to be a real red flag. When you look at the Bronze Age collapse, and almost every video I've seen from pop history, and it would have been what I would have presented, is a map like this and a date like this. Already we're seeing that these claims are most likely false, or at least not proven to be true. So Jesse then goes further and says, well, why is this the case? And he says, well, here's the problem. Mostly, there's no single answer to why this happened, but it seems like the main issue is that we don't have a good sense of what does collapse and what does destruction mean. destruction is in this case in the eye of the beholder. It's very much up to interpretation for the reasons that we stated earlier. You might date something incorrectly and have a tendency to want to pin it to a certain date because of some existing narrative, or perhaps you have data where I think there was one case of ash being located in a sediment, and that was something that was noted as destruction, even though that ash was next to a furnace, and therefore, you would expect ash in any case. So there's all sorts of these little things that bubble up, and we have a hard time grappling with what does destruction actually mean. Another thing that adds to this kind of misconception and infection of the data pool here is he says that there's an over-citation of certain books and articles which themselves have inaccuracies rather than the original excavation reports. So basically what he's saying is that over time these issues have compounded themselves as researchers have taken the work of either their contemporaries or prior people as sources of truth and attempted to build off of them and drawn inferences from them, assuming that they were true, versus if you go back to the original source of truth, then you would see that there's a big discrepancy. So this is what was kind of blown up, and this is what started my existential crisis for the Bronze Age collapse. Now, I'll finish with a rather salient point that Jesse makes. And he says, quote, "Now, this should not give the impression that there were no destructions at the end of the Late Bronze Age, because certainly there are some." He just goes on to say that, it wasn't as extreme as it is claimed to be by some authors. And even if destruction did occur, they're not all of equal measure. Some are big, some are small, and just how much they affected the cultures and the regions around them is debated. And he says this is a discussion for another time. Now, in our video here, we'll be able to have some of that time. But this is how I wanted to start, with just poking some holes in the general narrative of wide-scale destruction all occurring in a single time frame. As we've seen here, it's many different time frames, and the destruction may not even be destruction. This then moves into the second point that is often quoted is, well, you have this destruction, and, well, it was probably caused by the Sea Peoples. So let's now turn to the idea of the Sea Peoples. What I have here at the top is a table essentially summarizing our records, our primary records of the Sea Peoples. And the first point to make is most of these records are going to be coming from the Egyptians. We'll get into some sources from other people, but most of them is going to be the Egyptian writings about these Sea Peoples. These occur on, temple inscriptions, on papyri, on stelae, all kinds of different written records and accounts. And what I've done in this table is I've listed the traditional 9 groups that appear in the majority Egyptian records, and I've spaced them out to have columns here that represent different instances of them appearing in the record, and then I've tried to organize them based on their date. So this first one is going to be the oldest date, and then this is going to be the youngest date over here. So you can see a spread between. And the couple things to note when you look at the data in this way is, it looks like the arrival of the Sea Peoples is not a singular event. The most commonly cited event is going to be this one here in 1177. You've probably heard this quote, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their lands," blah, 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 it goes on and on. We'll get into that passage shortly, but this is the one that you often hear about, and by just hearing about this instance in the Egyptian record, it makes it seem like they came out of nowhere. But what you can see from this table is that we actually have records of the Sea Peoples occurring at other times. So there's a greater span temporally of the Sea Peoples, and also you see Sea Peoples coming and going. They appear, they disappear. There's waves and different frequencies of them. So that's the main takeaway here. One of the cool things that we also get from Egyptian records is some visuals on what they might have looked like. So these are quite distinctive, and it's kind of like a legend to help us pick them out in later Egyptian records. So we get some cool stuff from the Egyptians. Now, I wanted to go into, some specifics. So quote directly, what are the Egyptians saying about the Sea Peoples? Because it's important. We could look at a bunch of them, but I think the most pertinent one is to look at the record from the Medinet Habu discussing this big event, the biggest of the Sea People invasions that accosted Ramses III roughly around 1177 BC. And the reason I picked this one out is because this is the one you've probably heard, and it actually has embedded within it a lot of misconceptions coming from the Egyptians. So let's read this one in its entirety and kind of take it piecemeal as we go along the way and point out some things that could be misleading. So it starts off saying, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. This first one makes it seem like a couple things happened. First, that these people that they're going to mention are all coming from islands, and that they all had this as a pre-planned attack. what we'll see later with a bit more context is it probably seems like not all of the people mentioned came from the sea. Their origins are kind of unknown, but still we don't think that they all came from the sea. So that's for one thing to come out of this first sentence, literally, of the Egyptians. And the idea of a conspiracy is nice propagandic value, but what we'll see later is it doesn't seem that the sea peoples were as, far-sighted as one would imagine to make a conspiracy. Yes, certainly they planned this invasion, but not in the sense that they did it all of a sudden. We can even see that attested in the Egyptian records when we see that they came in and out of the historical record before and after this time. Next, what we see is they say, all at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. This is partly wrong because the all at once statement is contradicted by the fact that, we actually have sea peoples before and after, but certainly it is important to note that this is a big wave, so we'll give that one a half-truth. Moving on, they say, no land could stand before their arms from Kat, Kod, Karkemish, Arzawa, Shia on being cut off at one time. So basically what the Egyptians are saying here is, look, there's all these sea peoples and all of these other entities were destroyed by them. Kat, famously being the Hittites, and these other powers, Arzawa, Shia, Karkemish, these are the places on the fringes, either on the south in the Levant or on the western fringes of Anatolia. So basically the Egyptians are saying all of a sudden this big wave knocks out everyone. And this is one of the things that probably is what led to some early scholars to think, oh, look, the Egyptians are saying this happened all at once. Let me pool together all of these supposed destruction events on one date. And that ends up being an issue because what's most likely is it seems like the Egyptians, one, didn't have a grand sense of everything that was going on, and two, had this kind of tradition of compressing everything that happened in the purposes of just compressing history into a nice little propaganda package to put on their temple walls. So this claim that basically all these lands were destroyed is not true, and that's evidenced by some of the timelines we'll get into later. Continuing on, they talk about setting up a camp. Okay, that's fine. Then they say, okay, they desolated its people. Fine. They were coming forward towards Egypt while a flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was, and then they name some different peoples. And then they say, lands united. So this last sentence is, again, something that's a little bit misleading, where it seems like the sea peoples were much more united and centralized in their endeavors, having these grand conspiracies, whereas that's not really the case. They were not these, alien powers that got beamed down all of a sudden and rampaged everywhere. No, as we can see, they're rather more enmeshed in the history of Egypt and the broader Mediterranean than that. So a lot of misconceptions packed into our primary source here. Moving on, there's a couple other things that we should note when it comes to what the Egyptians are telling us. The first is, they're actually not telling us that these are sea peoples. In the Egyptian sources, they say, they might name a particular tribe and say they are of the sea, or they might mention a group and say in their isles, in their islands. But this only ever is used to refer to one person, a couple people. But it's modern sources which bucket all of them into the sea peoples, and that can be a bit misleading because even the Egyptians don't say that. And so we should understand that these people are not all from the sea. More specifically, that's evidenced by the fact that they came both by land and sea. So in this case, I've highlighted one of the Egyptian inscriptions from one of the battles with the sea peoples, and here you can see the highlighting of a cart with families. So they came not just as warriors, but as refugees and families as well. So that's something discredited in the popular imagination as well. The last thing that we've been talking about is, hey, it says up here lands united, but down here, my main point is, no, actually they were pretty loosely united. And so much so that they actually fought on both sides. So after one of these early battles with the Sheridan, Ramses II is actually able to defeat them, and then later on actually calls upon them to help him fight against the Hittites. This is actually an inscription leading up to the Battle of Kadesh. So you can see some sea peoples fighting for Egypt. Meanwhile, over on the Hittite side, they actually call on the power of the Luca. And you can see here the Luca are among the sea peoples, but both of these, when they appear, are fighting on either side of established powers that we would think would never work with them because they're going to ultimately destroy them, according to the traditional, pop history narrative. So already, we're seeing how a lot of holes are being poked. The next thing I wanted to point out is, what we've been talking about so far is all Egyptian-based records, but we have records from other places that seem to talk about peoples from the sea. But it's important to point out that these don't necessarily mean they're the same people. So to explain that more, you could see I pulled out 2 of these tablets, and essentially they're quite vague. So this one, a Ugarit tablet, talks about the enemy's ships came here. It's 7 ships of the enemy that came here and inflicted much damage upon us. So in this case, they don't actually say that it's the Sea Peoples. And in terms of quantities, it's just 7 ships. So it doesn't really seem like an invasion. Sure, it did damage, but it's more of a raid. So in this case, it might be tempting to say, oh, look at this. People attacking by sea, ships. It's probably one of these tribes, versus it's not necessarily the case because our primary source doesn't actually list that. Same thing goes with some of these other sources. But there are, cases to the inverse where we actually do have the same people showing up, the Sheridan. But in this case, it's in a completely different context that changes up our framing of how we think of the Sea Peoples. So in this case, it's basically a letter from the king of Byblos to the king of Egypt, essentially saying that, hey, a local group killed a Sheridan in his midst, took 3 other men captive, and ran away into the lands of Egypt. And this is the fascinating part. He basically says, a deed that has never been done since time immemorial has been done to us. So send the men back to Byblos, lest the city commit rebellion. So this seems to imply that there was a Sheridan, just one of these sea peoples, in the midst of Byblos. Okay, he's just about them. Cool, they know about these sea peoples. They're in their midst. But what's even further interesting here is when this sea person supposedly gets killed, the city is so angry that they might commit rebellion at the apparent death or killing of the sea person and the captive taking of others. So this kind of reframes our thinking of the Sea Peoples. It means that, we have these interactions with supposed Sea Peoples in more banal circumstances than just invasion. So it means that, the Bronze Age communities were aware of these groups as pirates, as raiders, as mercenaries, or maybe even their neighbors in some cases. And what's particularly interesting is this tablet is dated to roughly around 1340 BC, which if you go back and you look at our dating for these events, that's far earlier than these 1200, 1100 dates. So as early as 1340, you have people who will later on be the Sea People showing up at our records, again, just being a neighbor who's murdered that people are angry about. So that really hopefully helps reframe the idea of who are these Sea People, at least according to our records. But what you've derived from this is, they might mention the tribal names, but we don't actually know who they are. And that's going to be a problem that historians have tried to grapple with. And so what you might see when it comes to the Sea Peoples are these maps that say, hey, the Sea Peoples came from this region or that region, and they went this way or that way. But in the accounting of the records we've seen up here, you really don't have that evidence. So much of what you've seen here is very, very much a hypothesis. This should definitely be questioned in the same way that we question the waves of destruction from before in this map. So this is definitely an oversimplification, and it might even be a stretch. But how are people even getting to this level of assumption if it's not really in our primary sources? Well, there's a couple ways. So basically, people are going around and fishing for connections. Sometimes it's linguistic similarities between what the Egyptians tell us and different places. So for instance, the Luca could be Lycaeans, the Shekelish could be from Sicily, the Sheridan could be Sardinians, just playing off of similarities in the names. But that can be an issue because even if the connection is established and it's true, you don't actually know which direction it went. A good example is the Sheridan being Sardinians. Basically, is the name association there because they came from Sardinia or they went to Sardinia? And so that's kind of part of the confusion here. So that's kind of what this dotted arrow is supposed to show, that, oh, actually, maybe the Sea People went over there after they bounced off of the Egyptians. So a lot of these hypotheses for the origins really don't have much merit to them, especially if they're just based off linguistic similarities that can only take you so far. So people often look for other ways to have similarities. You have pottery. So for instance, they look in the Levant at places where the Sea People supposedly were, and they find instances of pottery that seem to have similarities with the Mycenaean area. So that's how they draw some connections between groups, is through pottery. But again, that can sometimes be flimsy. So what's happening recently is people are trying to pull in more concrete ways to look at this information. And one of the things that's coming about is, well, actually, we can probably use DNA. And this is a more recent development, trying to leverage DNA to find out the origin of these Sea Peoples. So here I'm pulling out a recent paper that came out in the last couple of years. And it's titled Ancient DNA Sheds Light on the Genetic Origins of Early Iron Age Philistines. And essentially what they do is they went up and they went to Ashkelon and they dug up some graves and they did some, DNA testing on these people. Now it's a very small sample size, but even among these, they did some analysis of these populations. And what they found is, and I'll quote you here, quote, "We find that the early Iron Age population was genetically distinct due to a European-related admixture. This genetic signal is no longer detectable in the later Iron Age population." So essentially what they say is we have a baseline understanding for what the genetic makeup is of the population. And then we look at these remains, and it looks like all of a sudden there's a spike in European-related admixture that then dies out. Implication being that these are foreigners, maybe the seed people, we don't know, who came to the lands, intermarried, and then got their genes diluted through the generations of being assimilated to the local area. And one of the interesting things about this is, this is a very small sample size with a range of possibilities. So for instance, this shows kind of potential genetic markings and where they could be tied to. So you can see very much broadly European. It's very vague. So be wary of anyone who tries to tell you DNA tells us anything specific. It's quite vague. But nonetheless, it can start to give us some indications of where things are headed. This Science article, for instance, talks about 4 Iron Age infants and that their genetic mix is more akin to populations from Greece, Spain, and Sardinia. So that is interesting. So I'm hoping that we get more results out of DNA. They may be the clue to breaking some of the impasse we've been at for quite a while. But regardless, it's not enough yet. So please be wary of any of these maps you might see or any claims to the origins of the Sea Peoples. That all being said, I did want to introduce you to Dr. Eric Klein. So he's got this great book, 1177 BC, which has a lot of this latest information that's being revised. And this is a good starting point for kind of wading into the Bronze Age collapse. And he ran an AMA on Reddit. And it's relevant because he was answering some questions about, given all of this confusion about the Sea Peoples, what is his takeaway? So I just wanted to quote him here to kind of cap off our discussion of the Sea Peoples with, an expert on the matter. And he does state his opinion, because oftentimes that's what we have to do with these uncertainties. But anyways, he says, quote, "I discussed this extensively in my 1177 BC book. I find it most plausible that they started their migration from the Western Mediterranean and then picked up people as they migrated to the Eastern Mediterranean, i.e. survivors from the collapse of the Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, etc., so that by the time they ended up attacking Egypt, they were really a mixed bag, both in 1207 and 1177 BC. But I also think that they were as much victims as they were oppressors, and that they are not responsible for nearly as much of the damage at the end of the Late Bronze Age that they are frequently blamed for." So that, I think, is a good capstone on the Sea Peoples. Again, we could go into further depth, but that gives you a good sense of a lot of the misconceptions about the Sea Peoples and maybe reframing what we think about their origins and the level of damage that they did. So if we're trying to mitigate the damage done by the Sea Peoples, probably we want to look for another culprit. And that's how I started a lot of this discussion, is that people throw kind of the kitchen sink responses at you, drought, famine, internal unrest, raiding, blah, 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 all this stuff. But behind it all, researchers are looking for these like prime movers. What is a big thing that may have started this domino effect? And it seems like climate change may increasingly be an answer to what precipitated a lot of these other things that eventually led to a systems-wide collapse. So with that being said, let's take a closer look at climate change. So starting at the top, when you look at climate change today, there's a lot of uncertainties, but at the very least, we can take measurements in the present. That's not the case in the past. You have to look and try and recreate the past climate, and that's a practice of paleoclimatology. And in order to do that, you can't take direct measurements oftentimes, so they have to look for what's called these proxy markers for what the climate might have been like. And this is pretty succinctly recapped in this paper by Brandon Drake titled "The Influence of Climate Change on the Late Bronze Age Collapse and the Greek Dark Ages." And he recaps a lot of these climate proxies that they've been using. So they look at rainfall proxies by looking at stable oxygen isotopes, speleothem records. Then they look at pollen records, which might tell you how many plants are active at the time. They can then look at sea surface temperatures derived from sediment cores. They can look at, within those sediment cores, what's the balance of warm and cold species to see how temperatures might have changed. They can look at temperature from Greenland ice cores, and they can look at what is the overall sun doing in this period by looking at beryllium in ice cores. They can also look at things like tree rings. They can look at lakes, lagoons, cave data, flood levels. There's a bunch of stuff that right now is getting more and more traction to try and solve, again, the kind of academic impasse to understand what happened. So this is, examples of people drilling cores under the water, pulling it out of the ice and starting to analyze data. So this is a map that was in the this article from 2012 that talks about the different places that they've been looking. So you can see they're going way out in the sea, close to shore, at these different centers of interest. And one of the things that you might see is, for instance, here, what happens when you look at the Greenland ice core, and over top, this is a model of the temperature that they can derive from the ice cores. And what's really interesting here is EBA is early Bronze Age, MBA is Middle Bronze Age, LBA is Late Bronze Age. And this is really interesting. Take a look at the temperatures here. There's a big peak and a precipitous drop off right around the Late Bronze Age, and then it tends to recover. So this is our first forewarning that, it actually looks like something is going on when it comes to the climate in this period of collapse. Below, you can see that they've superimposed the irradiance from the sun to try and see how the sun activity was in that time. So it looks like around the same period, there's a little bit of a dip in the radiance of the sun, but it's kind of within the level of noise from earlier periods, and it's not the same as this dip down here. So they're still trying to piece together kind of what was the cause. But this is a high-level macro view of like, whoa, what is the kind of overall temperature going on? And it's hard to go from there to specifics, both in terms of specifics of a date range and the behavior of certain areas. So for that, what I wanted to show you is some of the more specific analyses that people are doing when it comes to zooming in on particular locations to get a better sense of both the date and kind of the scope of the climate within a particular region. So this one is a really good recent paper. It's called Climate and the Late Bronze Age Collapse, New Evidence from the Southern Levant. By authors listed here. And essentially what they did is they went to this area of around kind of Israel, and they looked at the Sea of Galilee and various other areas, which are the intersection of these different biomes. And what they found actually, and I'll go down here on the pollen data that they were analyzing, is essentially, we'll go here to the chart, is they plotted here the levels of pollen from arboreal pollen, non-arboreal pollen. And essentially how to read this is you can see these green and yellow lines. The further to the left you are, the drier the climate, the further to the right, the wetter the climate. So you can track how it changes over time, and they have summaries of that kind of in these right-hand columns. And then what's really interesting is right around here, right when you would expect the Bronze Age climate crisis, a huge drop-off in pollen, which is dry, something happened that seems to be coinciding with the earlier temperature change that we saw at a high level. So it looks like the high level change is being reflected at the local level. And what's really interesting as well is it looks like it's not just a singular event of a couple years, but it's a more drastic event that started to take place earlier in the late Bronze Age here. So this is quite interesting. And I'll read you some of what they have to say when it comes to this pollen data. So quoting this, they say, "The most striking feature in the entire Sea of Galilee pollen record appears at the end of the late Bronze Age, between 1250 and 1100 BC. This time interval is characterized by the lowest arboreal vegetation percentages throughout the entire sequence. This event probably lasted slightly more than a century, and is therefore a relatively prolonged event, the most pronounced dry episode during the Bronze and Iron Ages." They then go on to say, well, maybe this was caused by, pollen dropping is because humans were having some sort of impact, but they were able to rule that out, or at least as much as they could rule it out, to try and conclude that, quote, "This decline therefore was a result of climate rather than man-induced change." So this is quite interesting where they say, no, something is really going on. And to kind of back this up, what they did is they pulled in some correlated data. So in this case, I'm showing some tables here that show the number of sites that exist or were at least identified across different ages of the Bronze Age. So EB is early Bronze Age, intermediate Bronze Age, mid Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age, and then you have Iron Age. So you can see these in the chart form, but what I did is I converted these on my own into into colors. So this is a little bit more evident. So what you can see is these different regions have different slight behaviors, but I summarized them all up. So you can see in the early Bronze Age, about 200 sites have been identified around Israel. Okay, it holds. Middle Bronze Age, it kind of dips before peaking. And then in the late Bronze Age, you see a very substantial drop-off. So again, correlation does not mean causation, but you can see they're trying to have more coverage in terms of, is this an anomaly? Is this a fluke? Are there multiple strands of data that all point in the same direction? And it seems like that's indeed the case. So after that, if they think something is happening, the obvious question to ask is why? What's the cause? And in this case, they look back at the Greenland Ice Sheet Project and look at temperatures. And this is, again, what we showed earlier, that they're pointing back to this spike and then drop off of temperatures around the late Bronze Age collapse. But this is something that's very important, because if I told you that this is what happened, it's very hard to deduce how this temperature spike here, spike and drop, leads to then drought. So by going directly to the paper, we can hear it from the horse's mouth, what is going on. So I'll again quote you this passage when they're describing the possible mechanism for how this caused a crisis. So we'll take it from the top. The late Bronze Age dry event was probably connected to the peak in Greenland temperatures. The highest temperatures there in the last 5 millennia centered around 1200 BC. This warming possibly led to an increase in glacial melt, which resulted in turn in an influx of cold fresh water that lowered sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean basin. This created an anti-phase event in which warming ultimately resulted in a drop in sea surface temperatures. The decline in Mediterranean sea surface temperatures limited freshwater flux into the atmosphere and thus reduced precipitation over land. So to repeat this, what they're saying is that you have this kind of converse effect in play where temperatures seem to rise, but it causes ice to melt. The ice then kind of messes up with the flow of water. It lowers sea surface temperatures. That lowering temperature then makes it harder for water to evaporate and then go into the air and nourish the land with water. So this antiphase event is what they're pointing at, or trying to point at, to say, hey, this is why we're probably having this crisis. And something that's noted here with climate change that I think is pretty apt to our modern day is they say, people and civilizations can adapt. We're resilient. We can adapt to slow trends. We can adapt and overcome to low frequency extreme events. Bad things happen. There's the freak drought. There's the freak event, whatever. Humanity, for the most part, can deal with it. But where things get really dangerous is when slow trends move fast, and that when these freak events become even more frequent. So not only do you have to deal with trends accelerating and happening more often, but the peaks of the craziness of the length of these droughts become more frequent. That can be something that overwhelms the resiliency and adaptation of people and civilizations. And that's what's proving to be kind of this poison pill that starts to kick off dominoes. So that is going to be it for climate change. We're going to be moving on to specifically how this may have impacted collapse amongst the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Egyptians. But I first wanted to finish off one last little comment on kind of natural disasters. So one other idea that's posited is this idea of earthquake storms, that, a lot of the destruction that we see happening around this period, maybe it wasn't the Sea Peoples, but maybe it was a giant series of earthquakes that happened, in this time. And it's not necessarily unreasonable. We saw recent earthquakes that have, tectonic plates shifting, and then you have some sort of earthquake storm where you have not just aftershakes, but then other earthquakes that get triggered by the same kind of general movement of the plates. So an earthquake storm is something that is understood. There is evidence of earthquakes, happening in this region. But from what I found in this article here, Crisis and Context, the End of the Late Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean by Knapp and Manning, they basically address the idea of this earthquake storm, and they say, yes, in theory it's plausible, but the people putting this forward have not proven that it was actually the case. And so this idea of an earthquake storm, while in theory might be possible, has not been proven to actually be the thing that caused the destruction of the cities that are at least confirmed. So I just wanted to address that before we move on. So now we have this climate change pushing drought across the regions. This may start to destabilize them. And you could say, well, it's going to collapse. We could stop there. We could say, hey, It's not the sea peoples, it's climate change. That's what causes the Bronze Age collapse. But we have to go further because there's a lot of nuance in how the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Egyptians collapsed, each in their own way. And what does collapse mean in their specific context? So with that being said, let's now dive more specifically into each of these groups to see how it unfolded. So we'll start with the Mycenaeans, and the Mycenaeans, were centered around Greece as you understand it. It extends a little bit further than this image I've shown here into the islands, and then a little bit of, Western Anatolia. But for the most part, we're dealing with this region. There are these different palaces, these different power centers scattered about the land. They're usually on top of the hill. They have a walled palace and then a greater wall around them that encompasses a lot of facilities. And these are the center administrative points and economic and military points that control then the states that are around them. So this is going to be Mycenaean Greece with these centers, these palatial centers in the middle. So one of the things about collapsing this system, when you put stressors on it, is, well, let's understand what is even the system in the first place. And so we kind of have to look at these palaces from an economic perspective. So there's this great article, or paper, I should say, that I found by Paul Halstead that's called The Mycenaean Palatial Economy, Making the Most of the Gaps in the Evidence. And basically, it's more of an economic look at things, so some of the terminology is dense and not something we're used to, but I'll try and synthesize and simplify what they're saying. And basically what they say is they are trying to show that these palaces were economic centers. Fine, that makes sense. And for evidence of that, they look at basically the records. So you have a lot of these linear B records, and they show records of livestock, labor, goods. And there's a couple things that start to point out to people with an economic mind when they look at this. I'll list a couple things. The first is they find that these items are listed separately with no equivalences or currency. And wealth is being centralized at the palace and then redistributed. So all of that kind of put together in economic terms makes for what's often called, a redistributive economy, or in this context, the palatial economy. And there are some excerpts here that we'll get to, but essentially from this diagram, what it means is essentially you have the palace sector. So think of the palace sector basically being the land that's going to be owned and ruled by the king, everything within here. So that means not just the workshops and the storage centers and the, all the specialized areas within here, but also, as they state here, all the agricultural estates that are owned by the palace. So that's what they're calling the palatial sector. And that exists kind of as its own entity. And it interacts with two different entities. The first is going to be the non-palatial, so like the domestic sector. This is all going to be your general peasants and other people in the kind of the around regions. And then you have external trade. And basically this economic paper is discussing how this system plays out. And there's a couple things that are unique to the system. So basically what they say is that the palatial sector basically takes in a lot of the, you can see the arrows coming from the left, agricultural labor, non-staples in the form of taxes, grains, non-specialist goods. They collect a lot of stuff from the peasantry. And what they do with that is then they use that to create workshops, or they upgrade some of these products by bringing in labor and creating more stuff like wool, wheat, olives, figs, grapes, etc. So they're able to kind of, I guess you could say, like upcycle some of the stuff from the general population and then send that back to the population once it's been upgraded by the workshops and the specialists as, more valued goods, craft goods. So basically you have simple materials that then get refined, and the value of having these pass through the palatial sector is that once they're back in the general population, these are goods of higher value that then can be traded to reinforce, to help give prestige to people, to be, support for someone for being your ally or whatever. These are goods that are useful. And as they say here, there's basically evidence that these are used as tokens of value in the exchange of staples. So basically, the palace serves to make these better goods that can then be used for various functions in the economy that are helpful to doing, more interesting things than simple bartering. The other thing that the article points out is that the existence of the palace as a center that collects and then redistributes goods is that it can act as a bank of sorts. So for instance, you have here your peasant who for some reason might have a good year. And when they have that good year, they might have excess crops and goods. And let's say that Great, they can't really do anything with that for the most part, unless they have a place to trade or store it. And that's the function oftentimes of the palace. The palace has these big areas where they have storage. So the peasant might not be able to have extra goods, but by sending in his goods and his excesses into the palace and putting them in these big, storage jars or converting them into the other goods, it serves as like a bank in general for the populace. And what can happen is in times where, there's not a surplus, but there's a deficit, the palace can then open its stores and send those back into the populace. So it's a nice little mechanism that makes the economy a bit more robust. But where things might have started to fall apart is in this system. Once you start stressing it with climate change and prolonged drought, if there's no more surpluses on this end, and this arrow of demand to the general public grows and grows and grows because of prolonged drought, then it puts strains on the palace, and all of a sudden the palace starts to shut down. It can't relieve the people. It can't do things. And in particular, the palace, there might be some inequalities between the general population and the palace, which is living large. So there's speculation that basically the palatial economy as it's set up, once you disturb it enough where the people get upset, it might pose... it might incite revolt among the people to try and overthrow the palace because it's too top heavy, eat the rich type of situation. So that's one of the theories that comes out of this understanding of the palatial economy. So what evidence do we have of this happening? Well, we have the fall of the palaces, and this happens in a couple different key places. First, there's evidence of military buildup. So around the late Bronze Age, we have evidence of fortification sizes being increased. We have mention of troop mobilization, although it's quite vague when they just say watchers of the sea. So there's evidence of something happening, some military buildup in this late period when the climate change is having its impact. There's destruction in the palaces. I know we were poo-pooing it earlier, but it is definitely the case that in the Mycenaean region, we do see destruction. That's evident by burnt structures. You have evidence of combat, arrows, swords, etc. And what's really interesting is sometimes it's attributed to the entire, stronghold. Oh, okay, an invader came in. Is something you might think. But sometimes the destruction is relegated to just the palace, which is kind of feeding the idea that, maybe it was a revolt from the people and they wanted to eat the rich, burn the palace, so to speak. Another thing that's evident of this system falling apart is the loss of Linear B. So Linear B is the earliest attested form of Greek writing, and it's predominantly going to be used by the people in the palace. And it starts to die out and basically disappears after 1190 BC. So that essentially attests to the idea that, hey, the palaces kind of go poof, and these scribes fall out of service, and we get the loss of the use of Linear B. So that is kind of all bits of evidence. But there are people who have started to try and quantify this even further. So there's this other paper by Sarah Murray who tries to document what does this palatial collapse look like. So she has a paper here on the demographic and domestic changes in early Greece. And again, just like climate, we can't have censuses of these periods, so we have to rely on proxies. They look at burials, settlement, and structures, and they look at ceramic evidence. All of this, again, is subject to interpretation, but still, we have to work with something. So from this, within the paper, essentially, she summarizes different assumptions or estimates that people have on what is the size of the population drop. And this is quite astounding to me. Some people on the high end think that the Mycenaean era got a 90% drop in population after this kind of big collapse. That is astounding. Snodgrass has it at 75%. These might be somewhat high, and so you see the percentages getting a little bit more reasonable, but even still, Murray, publishing in 2017, not too long ago, estimates a drop of 40 to 60%. And that's quite intense. Now, there are still people holding out the idea that basically, hey, it's probably not that high. We're reading the evidence wrong. Drops in these proxy pieces of data may be, not that they don't exist, but that they changed. Burial habits change, ceramics change, methods of constructing settlements change. So some people argue that the percentage is even lower. But for now, we're going to go with Murray's answer that it's somewhere on the order of 40-60%. That is insane. In this paper, she goes in further and tries to model, well, just how many people is that percentage being applied to? And in this final analysis, she tries to say that, hey, there's 600,000 people in the core areas of Greece in the Bronze Age, and that this number dwindles to a nadir of about 330,000 in the early Iron Age. So that to me is quite shocking. That means we have 300,000 people unaccounted for. We'll get into where did they go shortly, but there's one further point to make when it comes to this disappearance of people, is that it's not always uniform. And so this is a comparison that's also in the paper looking at different regions. So there's mainland Greece, there's Crete, and then there's different places within each of those. And what you're seeing is that, yes, most of them did see a drop from the late Bronze Age in dark to the early Iron Age in light gray, but it's not uniform. Some places were definitely battered versus others had minimal change or seemingly no change at all. So it's far from uniform. But nonetheless, regardless of where it happened, we definitely have some sort of huge demographic collapse. So the question therein is, where did they go? So there's all kinds of theories about where did they go. We're not quite sure. One idea is that there may have been internal migration, deurbanization, people forming new settlements, and so on. The other idea is there may have been external migration, so they might have formed colonies going to Cyprus. We have evidence of Mycenaeans there. There's this idea that's kind of old and discredited at this point that there was this Dorian invasion from the north, but this has kind of been discredited by archaeologists for the most part, where they think this Dorian invasion is just an invention of later Greeks who were trying to kind of post hoc come up with reasoning for why the Greeks were the way they were later on. Some people were clinging onto the fact that, oh, it's a distant memory, dim memory of something that did actually happen. But in this History of the Archaic Greek World, Jonathan Hall basically discredits that, and he says it probably did not reflect some dim and hazy memory, and he's essentially counteracting this idea of the Dorian migration. So there may have been some movement, but not really the Dorian one that's been discredited, which kind of leaves this lingering possibility that, okay, maybe they were really part of the Sea Peoples. And that's what's giving some credulity to this idea we were kind of knocking earlier, which is big arrows coming from the Mycenaean region. Well, maybe it doesn't seem that implausible when you consider kind of the demographic collapse in this period. So that's basically it when it comes to the Mycenaean palaces. You can see here that, yes, you could blame climate change, but it goes a lot deeper when it comes to the structure of the palatial economy, this kind of top heaviness, and how it could be susceptible to drought when it comes to, in particular, this non-palatial sector wanting to get more out of the palatial sector. So a lot of good information there. Next, we can move on to the Hittites. So the Hittites have, again, they're going to be buffeted by climate change. And I'll hop to those real quick. So, there's some stuff down here that I've collected on Hittite waterworks, basically saying that they are no strangers when it comes to drought and famine. They have these extensive, monumental dams and reservoirs and all these things. Hattusa, the capital itself, has these pipes that bring in water from aqueducts, and they feed the people, they nurse the people with water. They feed the crops as well. Same thing goes when it comes to grain. The capital of Hattusa has these huge grain silos that purportedly can hold 6,000 tons, which some people estimate as feeding 30,000 people for a year. So that's all great. So it looks like they have some resilience, but as we've said before, these resiliencies can be stretched. And in particular, we see evidence of letters where the Hittites in this period are increasingly relying on grain shipments from abroad, from Syria, from Egypt, to overcome maybe some of the deficits that they're having at home. And then to further point out that something is amiss here with climate change, there are people who have been looking at impacts of specifically in this region in the same way that we looked at pollen in the Levant. In this case, we can look at tree rings. So this study essentially looked at tree rings, and we're able to say that, within a very specific date range, 1198 to 1196, that there is a pretty sustained drought, and it was bigger than any of the kind of other years surrounding it. And you can see this in the data represented here, a big drop in the amount of moisture kind of in the area, and therefore, decreased tree rings. So basically all this to say is that, once again, before we talk about the specifics of the the Hittite collapse, I just wanted to reconfirm that, the data is there to support that this high level climate change that we talk about did actually start to impact the Hittites. So with that being said, let's talk about the nuances of the Hittites. So the Hittites are up here in the highlands of Anatolia. They have three different distinct periods that are somewhat arbitrary, but they do capture some essence of it. So the Old Kingdom period lasts 150 years about, and it's basically them in the highland regions consolidating power around Hattusa and doing some expeditionary raids abroad. They expand, but then in the Middle Kingdom period, it seems like something happened. They stumble, they retract. They're not quite as powerful, but then in the New Kingdom period, they expand. This period lasts about 250 years, and it's what gets you to the extent of all the green that you can see here, and that's the period of the Hittite Empire. in the New Kingdom. And that's essentially the empire that we're dealing with that then has to face climate change and that may be on the verge of collapse. So in terms of collapse, one of the biggest things for the Hittites that I think is relevant and that is echoed by Gary Beckman and others is essentially that the Hittite empire, as is stated here, was always a fragile structure and it's susceptible to people challenging its power. There's prolonged civil war that may cause issues. There are issues with entities breaking away. The ultimate conclusion here, just to jump the gun, is the idea that the fall of the Hittites was probably not a cataclysmic, single generation event, but rather as it says here, a breaking away leading to a progressive decline in the wealth and military might available to the capital and its rulers. So that's the general story that's put forward by Gary Beckman, who's well renowned when it comes to Hittite studies. But what does this mean? So more specifically, I think to demonstrate this point, what I've done is I put together I use the family hierarchy or the genealogy of the rulers of the Hittites at the kind of the end of the empire's period. And then what I did is I put crowns over the various kings, and I tried to link those kings as the succession flowed. And then next to them, I put little icons that represent things that happened that kind of led to troubled succession. So kind of in this period, you start to get, these daggers mean that someone was killed off. Okay, that's not good for a regime. But what seems to be most shocking is in this period, around 1370, when the Hittite Empire is actually supposed to be at its greatest extent, and even perhaps because of this, it seems like the traveling armies bring back with them plague. The plague is quite dire. I have a quote here from one of their, the actual original Hittite sources, and it says, Hatti has been very badly oppressed by the plague. People kept dying in the time of my father, in the time of my brother, and since I have become priest of the gods, they keep dying in my time. For 20 years now, people have been dying in Hatti. So a troubled succession that's maybe not necessarily driven by climate change. Maybe you could say that, plague is, but in this case, we already have some troubled succession. So, that shakes up the crown. One of the kings dies, two of his successors and heirs die. The crown passes to this final son here, and in the same period, while he gets the crown, two of his other brothers are made kind of regional governors. And what's important about this is these dotted lines is supposed to be my intent to show you that, hey, there's an official transference of power, but then kind of along the way, we get these dotted lines of power being transferred unofficially by these regional governors, where they will get local power, and in time, their followers will get more and more, local power, and they will essentially splinter off. So these areas are Aleppo and Carchemish. That's basically the areas around the new acquisitions around the Levant. And these are important to mention because they will eventually break away when the Hittite kingdom falls, and they will actually exist and live on and have some perpetuity after the supposed collapse of the Hittites. There's still some of their breakaway elements that exist. But other things that show up in this kind of chronology here is you can see the crown passing along. And there's an important point in time around here where it looks like a couple things happen. One, in this transference of the crown, the capital moves from, upland Hattusa down to Tara-Huntasa. And that's going to be a location that's probably down around here, closer to the coast. We don't exactly know why. Perhaps it was to coincide with Hittite activities in the Levant. We have the Battle of Kadesh in the same time period, but perhaps they wanted to be closer to the shore, closer to where the grain comes in, and closer to control of the coast, which maybe is a result of famine. We don't quite know. So you have that transference, but this causes a troubled succession. When you move the capital, the grip of the Hittites on the north apparently starts to be tumultuous. People start to rise up in rebellion. The neighbors nearby are licking their lips, thinking that maybe they can chew off some of the territory with the capital gone. And then further beyond that, there's another succession soon after. The capital is moved back to Hattusa, but it seems like the internal squabbles have not given up. This breaks out into open warfare among the Hittites. Here I've shown that there's a civil war. The crown goes from nephew to uncle, so it passes on to this king, and then he then passes it down. By the time you get to King Tatalia IV, there's evidence that he's building these large monumental dams, so presumably drought has been happening recently, and it's around this time that the crown passes quite quickly, and again, you can see an arrow that goes off where Tara-Huntasa basically gets its own delegation of power, and again, power is splintering out from the central crown of the Hittites, and eventually you get to the last king, and basically he's accosted with several things happening. There's a naval war with Cyprus, there's pressure perhaps from the Sea Peoples, not quite confirmed, but more so from the other powers, the Karkisa, other people from the north, from Anatolia, who come and seize upon kind of Hittite weakness, and perhaps the Hittites being not just their power being destabilized, but also being starved potentially in their army and their treasury not doing so well. And eventually you have Hattusa being sacked in 1190, but again, according to Gary here, he's saying that, yes, the capital was sacked, but in the decades leading up to it, it was probably abandoned. And then that leads us to the end of the Hittites. So in here you see a story that is not as simple as climate change. It also has to do with the coming of plague, the sharing of power, the delegation of power. So I wanted to bring that to you, that the story is never so simple cut, but obviously you can see here how the pressures of climate change may have very much accelerated some of these events that we're seeing. So now finally this takes us to the Egyptians. So let's take a look at the Egyptians and what their collapse looks like. So just as with the Hittites, which are broken up into Old, Middle, and New, the Egyptians do the same. It's just that the Egyptian time periods are so much larger. In this time frame that we're looking at New Kingdom Egypt, and this time frame is quite large. It spans several dynasties, but essentially the area that we're looking at here is from the Delta all the way down to Upper Nubia, controlling many lands in between, and extending their range of control up into the Levant and kind of these Canaanite cities where they quabble over them with the Hittites. So that's essentially where we're at. And in the same way that the Hittites have their own troubled succession, the Egyptians do as well. So what I've done here is I've shown you couldn't do a family tree with the Egyptians. It's too many, so instead we're just following the principal rulers and essentially looking at how these dynasties change in the duration. A couple things to take away here is that I've noted when the sea people start to arrive, it looks like they come about roughly where it seems like succession is tumultuous. So you can see a couple, dynasties change here, and then there's a couple short-reigned pharaohs. Oh, looks like the sea peoples are coming. After Ramses the Great, there's some quick successions. Oh, it looks like the sea peoples are taking advantage of that. So it seems like this quick succession of pharaohs has led to some externally visible weaknesses. On top of that, what we're seeing is that in this later period, this is where we get to the Bronze Age collapse, 1200 to 1150 BC. So it's in this period where the sea peoples are coming, things are happening, it's looking dire. We have evidence in the records of natural disaster, civil unrest, military setbacks, all kinds of bad things happening here. And there's even, to make it worse, Ramses III, who is famous for kind of saving people, averting Egypt from the Bronze Age collapse by defeating this third and final sea peoples invasion. He's really, he should be the triumphal king of Egypt, but even him falls prey to the harem conspiracy. As a quick tangent on this one, we actually for a long time have had records of an attempted coup against Ramses. We had his mummy, but it wasn't quite clear if he was killed off in the coup. But it just so happens that recently, more analysis, some scans have actually confirmed that, yep, it looks like his throat was definitely slit. It looks like there were multiple wounds, and it looks like he was actually killed. So that evidences something quite troubling, which is Ramses III, who is, should be a great pharaoh, actually ends up being killed in this conspiracy. And then after him, you have a bunch of following pharaohs in quick succession who deal with a bunch of issues. And especially with the sea peoples, they have drained the treasury of Egypt and may have dealt a mortal wound. To give you some context on what that looked like, I just have some quick passages on the sea peoples and their involvement with the Egyptians. So it comes in several different waves that they crescendo. We talked about this earlier. First, it's just the Sheridan people. They attack Ramses II, and essentially it's just a raid, kind of. It's a raid in force, but Ramses is able to bait them attack his coast and launches a surprise attack and sinks them at sea. And then what he does is he takes the Sheridan and he makes them his bodyguards, and they fight with him at Kadesh. So that's the first sea peoples arriving. Doesn't seem too significant. Later on, however, in 1208 BC, this is where you actually have the neighboring Libyans who invade, and they seek the help of 5 different sea peoples. And they bring their women and children. So this is probably showing that there's more and more internal weakness visible within Egypt. Apparently the battle itself is against the pharaoh Merneptah, and he basically, what he does is he finds a good way to defeat the sea peoples, and it basically has to do with having archers firing away at these sea peoples. Apparently that lasts about 6 hours until they're sufficiently weakened, and then he sends in the chariots to break up the sea peoples. And in doing so, he kills 6,000, captures 9,000. So this is a slightly larger invasion, but it gets even worse in 1177 BC. This is the big one where you've probably seen these murals of the sea peoples invading in these massive battles. In this case, it's a huge confederation, and basically it's against Ramses III, the one who eventually is assassinated. But in this time, it's his moment of glory, and he defeats them both at land and at sea at these two massive battles, and eventually actually has some follow-up punitive campaigns against the attackers. But even still, as we've shown here, he might have been great, but it looks like the effort it took to defeat the Sea People was not enough. You have evidence in this period of actually the first recorded labor strikes, perhaps because the treasury was running out of money, and then eventually, like we said, Ramses is assassinated and there's this attempted coup. So the Sea People seem to have contributed to Egypt's decline, but it didn't actually collapse in this period and may have gone on further. So then we might ask, well, what did actually bring about the collapse of Egypt? And this is where it was an internal threat to the Egyptians. And it's actually going to be probably the temples within Egypt and the weakening of the pharaohs that led to the end of the New Kingdom Egypt. So just kind of to give you some context, recall how we talked about the Mycenaean palaces being centers where, a lot of goods come in and there's an exchange and there's a specialization and production of key materials. You kind of have the same system happening over in Egypt. And this is kind of what this diagram is supposed to represent. So there's this difference between the local people, the common people, and then the higher ups. There's usually there's the domain of the pharaoh and the royal estates and the nobles. But what happens in the New Kingdom period is that there's a new kind of organ of the state that comes about, which is the temples, that increasingly get larger and larger and larger, and they function as their own group that then can gain power internally, such that by the time that there's perhaps collapse or a power vacuum in Egypt, when the power vacuum happens here, in the Mycenaean case, it seems like the palace weakens. Well, the only other people to take control is going to be the non-palatial sector, or the everyday people. Versus in Egypt, if there is actually, another internal organism that can take the place of the pharaoh, well, they're going to step in before the people can. So that's kind of what you see happening in this period. And to give a little bit more meat to this context, I have some figures here that talk about the growth of New Kingdom temples. So a big one is going to be in the New Kingdom period. You have the rise of the god Amun, who is very powerful. He's based out of Thebes. And Thebes is important is because it's a capital kind of more in southern Egypt, where for the first dynasty of the pharaohs, and we can go up here, in the 18th dynasty, the capital is at Thebes. Later on, it moves closer to the delta, but early on, there's a lot of power concentrated in Thebes. The cult of Amun is more and more powerful, and so the temple at Thebes grows larger and larger. And even though the capital might move further away, Thebes still maintains its presence as a big center of power. And we see that really showing up here when you look at some of the records that's kept by these various places. So this is a table showing that Thebes, basically in some of the collection of goods and materials that it has, in the records gets 80,000 people, 400,000 animals, almost 600,000 fields, in terms of acres, 65 towns, 46 construction sites, 83 boats. So you can see here over time, the temples are getting larger and larger. And one of the reasons why this is happening is because the temples do have a place to play. What happens is that as New Kingdom pharaohs get more and more powerful, they want to legitimize themselves. They want to show that they have the favor of the gods. So they start supporting these temples as ways to aggrandize themselves. So the way it works in Egypt is there's actually a neat little check on the balance of power. Essentially, it's the pharaoh's job to do big new construction projects. This is what helps stimulate the economy. So the pharaoh holds the keys when it comes to building the temples. But then the temples themselves, in terms of collecting tribute, collecting goods, and running themselves and running their estates, is up to the temple proper. So you have a duality there. Yes, the temples are getting larger, stronger. They may, eventually revolt, but the pharaoh holds in his hands the power and the sole benefit of being able to be the one who actually builds new things. So there's a little bit of a reciprocity and a check on power there. But what happens in the later Egyptian period is you see that check on power start to erode. And there's this great paper, The Ancient Egyptian Economy by Brian Moose, who essentially starts to list this. And we'll go through this. And basically what he does is he looks at the New Kingdom period and he says, the records and the table that we looked at shows the endowments made by Ramses III for the gods of Egypt and their temples. And essentially it shows a huge amount of land being given to these temples that's accounted for. Of the total cultivated area in Egypt, it seems like in just this accounting alone, about 13 to 18% is what it says here, is being given to these temples. So a huge amount of land power is given to the temples, and beyond this, there's an even further idea that maybe that's just the tip of the iceberg. To quote this, it says, "Thus, the total amount of land held by the temples and Ramesside Egypt may have been considerably higher than these figures," because again, these figures are just looking at a single snapshot. Probably the totality, they had more power. To further, drive this point home of the temples getting more and more powerful, is this quote that I've extracted here about temple expeditions. And it's kind of a salient point about this dynamic. So it says, quote, "In both the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the king frequently ordered royal officials, such as viziers and provincial governors, to exploit mines and quarries in the deserts. In the New Kingdom, however, the king frequently assigned the rights to exploit desert mines to various temples and mortuary temples, especially in the Ramesside period." So not just are these temples getting, at least 15% of arable land, if not more, but it looks like they're getting, never before seen rights and access to get mines and more wealth. So it seems like the pharaohs, as they get weaker over the course of this New Kingdom period, the temples get empowered and they essentially shake themselves loose. And that's what you see happening with the last pharaoh. At one point, the high priest of Amun Themes essentially becomes the de facto ruler of Upper Egypt around 1080 BC. So that's the story of Egypt. And as you can see, yes, climate change may have been a stressor on each of these, but they had their own mechanics for collapse. Now we can finally look at what this has to do, because each of these individual collapses probably had a ripple effect on the other. We started off saying this is the world of the Bronze Age, and that they're all interconnected by trade and goods and surpluses and all this kind of stuff is happening, and that you can get a domino effect. And so, for instance, if I were to do a mock-up here, let's say that you have climate change that starts to happen, and maybe that means that you have grain shortages that happens here. Oh, that might mean that the economy goes down. That might mean that the palatial, system that we talked about leads to revolt. The revolt might mean that, people start to run. As they run, they might then start to raid and destroy places. If they start to raid and destroy places, that diverts the Hittites, makes them look over here. Maybe that opens the door for an assault here. Maybe the Hittites, as they do their campaigns, they're going further abroad, and maybe that, pulls in the plague. And as all of this is happening, there's more and more ripple effects because all of these powers are connected. Egypt can no longer trade with the Aegean region, same thing with the Hittites. And so you have a great big question mark of how all this stuff might have propagated. And this is still one of the big unknowns for this period, is what is the chronology of these events? So what I wanted to conclude with is back to one of these papers. There was a really nice diagram that I found, and the paper itself is the paper that was the one focusing on pollen in the Levant, but they presented within this paper kind of a flow chart for what might have happened. So what they're positing is essentially, I'll try and show both of these at the same time. What they're positing is that there's a climate change event, which we've seen pretty well attested to at this point, drier and cooler climate conditions in the Near East and in the Levant. In the Near East, it causes crop failures, deterioration of grazing opportunities. A lot of people are not doing well in the general populace. Rise in food prices in the Mycenaean culture in Hatti, that leads to famine. Famine leads to social disturbance. Groups start to migrate by land and sea, havoc and destruction. This may have led to the sea peoples arising as people run and flee. This leads to wars. That then goes into Egypt. Egypt deals with already the drought coming from above, that's this line, and then the wars and the sea peoples, that's kind of from these other groups. This then leads Egypt to retreat from the lands of Canaan. And what that does is Canaan, which is already kind of suffering from the same types of drought, now has a power vacuum. As Egypt leaves, who's going to take control? Economic and political instability. You have these so-called Apiru groups, which are just basically, to my understanding, bandits, people who are otherwise gainfully employed, who now turn on each other in their desperation. They attack cities. There's destruction, more economic and demographic decline. And as this happens, it's kind of like bouncing back and forth across the entire Bronze Age, and it crescendos in this total collapse of society. So that's kind of where academia is leading here. And again, still much of it is up in the air. The level of collapse is not total. There was still continuity in this period, but something definitely did happen, and we're still figuring out what's the chronology and what's the magnitude of it. But as you can see, kind of zooming back out on this whole process, this whole journey, you can see why I had my crisis. There are so many little nitpicks and nuances to this discussion that were key to understanding what happened. So with that being said, thank you so much for entertaining my kind of train of thought and my new innovation in terms of how we present information to you. I hope it's been useful for learning about the period, and also useful for learning about how to question sources and be a good skeptic overall when it comes to historical claims, especially when it comes to people like myself, YouTubers. We can often get it wrong, and even academics, as we've seen here, have fallen into pitfalls. So yeah, with that being said, I can't thank you enough for sticking with me through the whole video, and I'll see you in the next one. And of course, check out Total War Pharaoh. See ya.